Hello and welcome to our fifth AI webinar session, asking the question, what is the UK's regulatory position on AI? My name is Victoria Horden and I'm joined today by colleagues from Taylor Wessing, as well as a guest speaker, Lulu Fremont from Milltown Partners, and they will now introduce themselves, beginning with Alison, then Claire, and then Lulu.
Hello, I'm Alison Dennis. I'm International Co-Head of Life Sciences and Healthcare at Taylor Wessing, based in London.
Hi, I'm Claire Reynolds. I'm a Senior Counsel advising on FinTech matters here in London, including commercial and regulatory aspects of new technologies like AI.
Hi, I'm Lulu Fremont. A big thanks to Taylor Wessing for inviting me today as the guest speaker. I work at Milltown Partners. For those of you that don't know Milltown, we're an global advisory firm working with technology businesses on regulation and government policy in the UK and the US. Prior to this, I was head of digital regulation at Tech UK. So hoping to bring some insights into the views of the tech sector towards AI regulation.
Fantastic. So the UK government set out its position on regulating AI in its white paper in March, and it didn't propose any additional AI specific regulation, such as we're seeing in the EU under the AI Act. And those of you who are looking at the news yesterday will be aware there was no proposal for a specific AI regulation in the King's Speech. So essentially the UK position is for existing regulators to regulate the use of AI in their individual sectors or areas according to principles set out in the white paper. And the slide here sets out the position of UK horizontal and vertical regulators. So you can see horizontal regulators are those such as the Information Commissioner's Office, who has a remit to regulate information rights, data protection for all sectors and all areas. And again, similarly, the Competition and the Markets Authority has that remit in the context of competition and consumer regulation across all sectors. But then if you look at the vertical regulators, you'll see such as the MHRA, who has responsibility to regulate medicines and medical devices. And then we have the FCA, Ofcom, Gambling Commission, each have their own particular remit. So today we're going to look in particular at the MHRA and the FCA with responsibility to regulate companies providing financial services. So that is a little bit of a snapshot of what we had from the white paper. But a lot has happened since then, since it was published in March. And last week was extremely busy for the town of Bletchley in Buckinghamshire, as I'm sure you all know. There's been growing calls both up to that AI Safety Summit as well as since then, growing calls for some form of AI regulation in the UK. And this is a huge topic. And in the time we have today, we are limited in what we can cover. So we're just going to capture a few of the themes, a few of the ideas that have come up as part of these discussions. Lulu, you are a close observer of the tech industry, particularly as you just mentioned your background at Tech UK. If you just join me then in thinking about these couple of questions. What was the reaction of the tech sector to the UK government's white paper back in March, published on AI regulation? And has there been a change of mood within the sector around how to regulate AI since March?
Thanks, Victoria. It's a really interesting question. I think when seeking to answer it, we need to think about first the diversity of the technology sector. This is not just one set of businesses. I think, we've heard a lot about a focus on sort of frontier AI safety recently with the AI Safety Summit, but actually the sector is much broader. Lots of businesses are not developing AI, but they're deploying AI. Both are equally important for this notion of AI safety. And if we think about from March until now, this is where the sort of widespread eruption of generative AI has really become, widely used among society. It's become quite mainstream, the likes of ChatGPT. That has all happened within the time of the white paper being published through to the AI Safety Summit. So inevitably, the mood has changed. If I go back to March and thinking about how tech companies were responsive to this, I think the AI white paper is a very long document. It sets out a regulatory approach. It does not set out sort of statutory regulation. There is no intention for it to be placed on statutory footing. And I think the Prime Minister confirmed that at the AI Safety Summit, that they want to understand the technology, understand the risk before regulating, and rely on sort of voluntary commitments and working closely with the sector through existing initiatives to actually address some of those risks, which I'm sure we'll get on to later in the discussion. But for a tech company, that's actually a very strong approach towards regulation, because it is pro-innovation. It does give you room to adapt your services and to think about safety through your design without having to change everything to comply with regulation. In addition, the AI white paper was supported because it's very much risk-based but context-specific. It's not looking at regulating the technology itself. It's all about the use of the technology. And I think that has been welcome among a diverse range of tech businesses, because it's not having regulatory interference with specific types of technology, which for tech businesses might be seen as quite anti-innovation. And then I think finally, it's been very much sort of quite light touch. And I think that having a deepened understanding of how the technology works is essential for businesses to feel like regulators are looking to regulate in a proportionate and necessary way. So if we look at the white paper approach, it's been very much welcome and appreciated. But as I lined out, there's been so much change since then in terms of how technology is developed, and also about how the technology is used, that it has sort of ignited the Prime Minister and also a range of government sort of ministers and officials to actually have to think about regulation in a slightly more serious way. The way in which they've gone about this has largely been driven by the Prime Minister himself through the AI Safety Summit. We heard a few months ago that the UK was going to introduce guardrails around AI. This was kind of an indicator of, are they going to regulate, are they not? Is this white paper going to be placed on statutory footing? Following that, we had the AI Safety Summit. And I think a lot of tech companies that are not developing AI but are deploying AI were frustrated with the narrow focus of the AI Safety Summit, because it has been so targeted on foundation models, on those companies that are really at the frontier of AI safety and focused on existential risk and national security. And for a lot of tech businesses, actually, when they're deploying AI, what matters is the safety of the user. Yeah, thinking about societal risks and societal protections. So the AI Fringe event, which Miltan actually ran, tried to sort of draw together that gap, involve civil society, academics and tech companies to think about societal risks. But I would say there has been frustration as a result of a very narrow focus on the AI Safety Summit.
No, that's really useful. And actually just thinking a little bit more about the outcomes from the AI Safety Summit, what were your first impressions of those discussions, the commitments? You know, we got the Bletchley Declaration, and were there any surprises in your view as to where we are now following the AI Safety Summit?
Yes, I think if you look at it from a bigger picture perspective, the summit was a success for facilitating a global dialogue. I don't think anyone could say that it wasn't. We've got France and South Korea now saying that they're going to host the next AI Safety Summits. It started off a trend. When it comes to the policy and regulatory commitments, there are some questions around the actual tangible impact that they will have on UK regulation, if any. The Bletchley Declaration is significant because it's got the US, the UK, the EU and China all agreeing to it, and considering how AI is largely seen as an arms race when it comes to its development, that's definitely significant. It sets out routes for information sharing. It's thinking about that narrow focus on frontier AI. The setting up of the AI Safety Institute, we're seeing this in the UK, we're also seeing it in the US. So I think there's a lot of initiatives that are being set up and commitments that are being driven by governments, both nationally and internationally. But when it comes to that regulation question, I think we need to put this in context that we're entering into a general election year, has to take place before end of January 2025. So really, if the UK, and you mentioned yesterday that the King's speech did not include any reference to an AI bill, so the chances of AI regulation being introduced are quite slim. And considering how much the Labour Party are ahead in the polls, I think there's an important question there about what does Labour think and what is the actual direction going to be for regulation. taking into account the EU that's already gone and done it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come back to touch on that later on. But for the moment, thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Alison and Claire, who are going to explore the themes developing from two particular sectors, life science and the financial services sector, and how the respective UK regulators are responding. So Alison and Claire.
So if we start with life sciences and healthcare. So in life sciences, we anticipate that there will be AI uses across a very broad range, actually, of activities. Probably the main one that we think of regulating, and which I'll refer to a lot during this talk, is on medical devices. So software medical devices are used across healthcare. There are many of them and lots of developments going on using AI within those medical devices. But equally, there are platform technologies which are being developed to discover new products. And there are things like telehealth products, which aren't necessarily medical devices, but still are using AI in a variety of different ways. So if we look at the medical device regulations so far, and these are interesting because we're in a state of regulatory flux for medical devices. It's an area where the MHRA has really taken up the baton to look at regulation of AI within the devices. Actually, we are in a sector where there's been a lot of deep thinking about regulation altogether. Some of it comes out of the Cambridge Review of 2020, where a number of products were looked at in detail, all of which involved use by women, and also the discrimination that happened in terms of the way they were used, and women not being listened to when there were issues with those products. As a result of that, there was in August 2022 an independent review of equity, actually just in medical devices, and this is all relevant to bias. It just in life sciences products altogether, but for AI, bias is a big issue, and we'll come back to that. Because of Brexit, the UK is having to develop its own regime for medical devices, and we had a consultation in response to that. And through that, the government has said that they're going to look at regulating software in a slightly different way from other types of medical devices, and part of that is handling AI products. And the government has been working with Health Canada and also with the FDA, and they've produced 10 guiding principles, which is a starting point for companies who are in the development phase. So they've got these 10 guiding principles for good machine learning, all of which you would anticipate to find, but at least are providing some sort of guardrails for those companies who are in that development phase. And they've only just in the last week actually put out some 5 guiding principles for predetermined change control plans. I'll talk about those again a bit later. So a few key themes for life sciences and healthcare. Existing regulations are going to be used, and many of them are actually relevant to the use of AI, things like product liability, MDR, so the UK medical device regulations, GDPR. The question is how to equip regulators to cope with what are quite unique challenges of AI. And so there's going to be an awful lot of learning to go on there for the regulators. And also, of course, the users, particularly doctors. To what extent can they and should they be trusting AI systems? There are a lot of promises in terms of healthcare changing enormously through the use of AI products, some of which are already out in the market. But doctors do need to use them. Well, A, want to use them, so there's a trust element, and B, they need to know to the extent to which they perhaps should discount some of the provision that they receive from those devices. So there are a great many reasons for using AI medical devices. They can reduce inequalities in healthcare provision, as long as there aren't biases. Again, we'll come back to that. But because devices normally are regulated on a sort of point in time basis, with products that are based on AI and constant change, that is an issue, and ensuring ongoing safety for these constantly changing devices and thinking devices that are developing from data as it is created, it is an issue that they're working on. And so there's a few key questions that the regulators need to think about. One is how much you have to explain how your device works. First to regulators, who are the ones building trust, to consumers, but also to your doctors. If you look at the EU AI Act, it requires sort of an extreme level of explainability, but query in my mind the extent to which consumers really want to have every app on their iPhone explained to them. They just want to be able to use it and have some level of trust. Cybersecurity obviously is a key issue. The harm that can ensue from medical devices using AI not working or having some sort of cyber attack is huge, so that's really important. And then there are going to be regulatory sandboxes for this development and changing nature of the product, and seeing how those work is going to be interesting.
Thanks, Alison. So I think it's really interesting that a lot of the themes that Lulu and Vicky and Alison have picked up in other contexts also apply very much in a similar way in the financial services context. So I'll keep this sort of high level with some of those big picture trends. But I think you know, the UK financial services authorities recognise the many potential benefits of AI and the need to have a sort of pro-innovation approach to encourage that, but also the specific risks and the specific challenges of regulating AI in particular. As Alison mentioned, you know, we're all talking about regulation of AI, but there is already an huge amount of existing law out there that does touch on AI in certain cases, and that's very true in financial services as well. I think the real challenge that the industry is having and that the regulators are facing is to have clarity on how some of those existing laws actually apply to AI, and that has been recognised as one of the challenges to greater AI adoption in particular. So in financial services, there's been a couple of specific initiatives on AI that you can see on the slide there. I think in particular, the FCA has been quite keen to encourage dialogue and input with stakeholders, including through the AI Public-Private Forum and also through a discussion paper that we recently received feedback from. So it is clear that the FCA isn't sort of rushing on its approach here, and that dialogue with industry is really important as part of that innovation approach. So at the moment, we still don't have specific policy proposals in financial services, and that's likely part because of the broader picture here about the regulatory environment in the UK. But there are a couple of key themes that I'd like to touch on briefly. I think firstly, the authorities, and we're talking about the FTA, the Bank of England and the PRA here, they do recognise that we're at a pivotal junction here in terms of regulating AI, and that they have responsibility within their sector for ensuring this a safe and responsible adoption. At the same time, though, they sort of see it as too narrow to think about just AI alone. There's also related areas like consumer safety, data, digital infrastructure and resilience that also overlap heavily, and again plays into some of the challenges of regulating AI as a technology. Links to the idea really of technological neutrality. You know, as Lulu mentioned, it's about regulating the use of the technology and its actual application rather than the technology itself. The FCA doesn't normally mandate or prohibit specific technologies, for example, but they do recognise that in some cases, certain technology might need raise novel challenges that requires its own sort of regulatory approach, or perhaps guidance or use of other policy tools to clarify how the regulatory expectations apply to that technology. And we've seen similar with cloud computing and other technologies, for example. And I think there's also a lot of discussion around the wider national and international picture here, and particularly standards and to what extent standards can be used to help drive trust and when the technology is developing so quickly. So that wider piece that Lulu has been talking about is very relevant. So I'm conscious of time, and there's some more details on the slide there, but I think there are some really big key questions here, like to what extent the existing regime and regulatory environment can be used versus new AI specific regulation that the regulators are taking their time to sort of get to grips with. And so picking up some of the sort of key focus areas then, as Lulu mentioned, I think, you know, what really matters in the regulatory picture is ultimately the impact on the users and impact on consumers in particular. So avoiding harm to the consumer, or in healthcare, the patient, has definitely been one of the key themes that we've seen come out of the financial services discussions on AI. And this is in financial services, but it's also across the ICO, for example, and the CMA in the broader work that they are doing, looking at the consumer implications of AI foundation models, for example. So there's definitely that consumer lens that sort of runs throughout the UK regulatory environment, as Lulu mentioned. In the financial services context, for example, the FCA's approach to consumer regulation is based on a combination of the FCA principles, particularly 6, 7, 9, and 12 on the slide here, but also its other rules and guidance. And anyone in the financial services sector is probably reasonably familiar with the change in the new consumer duty this year, which has caused a lot of challenges and will probably raise challenges in AI specifically. But I think one thing the industry and regulators can agree on is that consumer outcomes should be at the forefront and a key focus of regulatory approach. Alison?
Thank you. So if we look at medical devices, one of the focus of regulating a medical device is the question of who is using it and ensuring that there's harm doesn't come to them. Another principle is safety and efficacy, and they're keys to being able to use a medical device. And part of the regulation currently is undertaking a risk factors assessment and then working through those risk factors and how to reduce them. All of those have applicability to AI systems. The challenge, of course, is for regulators to be able to actually understand what is going on in a product to be able to make the assessment of safety, particularly the elements of the way in which a product adapts and takes on board new information as that is developed. So those are all things that we're very much used to dealing with, but I think we are going to have to see some detailed guidance, both for regulators and for users, particularly hospital users of devices. Personally, I think that consumers who are purchasing for their own use some forms of medical devices are likely to simply rely on the CE or UKCA mark as a trust mark, and to assume that the regulators will have taken into account, which they ought to have done, their own needs. So if we move on to fairness and bias, as I mentioned earlier, actually there's an awful lot of devices, but also pharmaceutical products where there is a level of inequality. A lot of that is down to the fact that clinical trials are quite often in a relatively small population, and a population who tend to be living close to hospitals and also have the time to participate in clinical trials, which means that from a gender and racial diversity, there's quite often limited data. Obviously, if you're building AI models using limited data, then bias comes through, but it is already a known issue for devices. But fairness and bias is something that all AI products are going to have to come to grips with, because they're all built around data, and discriminatory decisions that are on the sort of the training models will then come through potentially into the outputs of those products. So using personal data as well is an issue that obviously we're used to dealing with under GDPR, but there's a vast amount of data that will be used to train all of these products. So all issues that need to be dealt with. There are various standards, and for medical devices, ISO standards are used frequently. There's one actually for information technology and bias in AI systems that I think we're like to be turning to. I can see those also being developed with greater depth for medical applications where you're using sensitive personal data, and bias can have some have huge health consequences as well. The UK has, as I mentioned earlier, undertaken a review of equity in medical devices. We haven't seen the outcome of that, but there's also a Standing Together project where we've got multiple regulators who are all looking for standards and setting standards, and they've just produced a report in the last 24 hours, in fact, on diversity, inclusivity and generalizability in medical devices and in pharmaceuticals, and making sure that there is less bias. They're never going to eliminate it, but less bias in the systems that we're using. Talk about financial services, Claire.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And as Alison mentioned, discriminatory decisions by any AI systems could potentially be a breach of the Equality Act, and this is an issue that applies across multiple industries. But in financial services, for example, there has been a really big focus on fairness and bias, and firms taking their obligations under, for example, the consumer duty and guidance for vulnerable customers really need to think carefully about how those duties apply to their use of AI in order to ensure fairness. For example, the consumer duty doesn't necessarily prevent the use of AI for pricing models that result in different pricing strategies for different groups of customers, for example. But if a certain AI-derived price discrimination strategy did result in poor outcomes for certain groups of customers or vulnerable customers, then that could potentially breach the Equality Act and the financial services principles and rules. So it really is something that firms need to think about quite carefully. Ultimately, it comes down to firms being able to monitor, explain, and justify the approach that they're taking to their use of AI deployment, and understand if that could result in differences for different groups of customers, for example. And I think that's one of the real challenges here when we think about some of the sort of explainability challenges with AI, particularly the sort of black box models, for example. So fairness and bias is a particular area where the industry calling for more clarity from the FCA on practical interpretation of some of these concerns. Coming on then to the role of governance. So good governance is essential for the safe and responsible adoption of AI, arguably in any sector. Governance concerns sort of underpin effective risk management, and that spans the entire AI life cycle. So, for example, as on the diagram here, when you look at the data level of an AI system, there's governance and oversight questions relating to the quality of the data, how it's ingested and processed, what monitoring reporting there is in place in relation to the data. Similarly, at the model level, there's governance questions around how oversight of how the model is actually deployed by the business, and managing changes to the model and monitoring its outcomes. So there's various governance challenges that apply to businesses in any sector in terms of their deployment of AI, in part to ensure those good consumer outcomes that we talked about earlier. Governance is a particular focus in financial services, where there's multiple existing regulatory frameworks around governance itself, and the authorities are looking at the additional challenges and risks that AI brings to firms' decision making, particularly when we're thinking about where AI is used to facilitate autonomous decision making, for example, or where it may eliminate human judgment. One key topic is how is how to ensure accountability for these sorts of decisions, in particular under the senior managers and certification regime, who is accountable, which specific function in the business is this, or should there be a new specific function under SMCR, which is something that the industry seem to be resisting. So overall, I think many people recognise that governance is a real challenge with AI.
And in terms of life sciences, I think governance is interesting for particularly areas such as development of new drugs using platform technologies that are built on AI models. These actually are not subject to regulation and yet could be used for quite harmful purposes. If, for example, the platform, instead of producing drugs which are helpful to mankind in curing diseases, actually start producing things like harmful products that can be deployed in war or terrorist cases. So without any regulation around that, query whether we may need that or not, or whether the other laws perhaps are suitable for that. In terms of other governance for medical devices, the UK is looking towards a reliance model, which means accepting devices which have been regulated in other countries. And that actually means that the UK, for many medical devices, probably most of them, will not be governing the regulation of those medical devices. They'll have the option to say no, but essentially they'll be trusting other people's governance mechanisms. Governance also applies in the sandbox approach and the collaboration of different regulators to get products onto the market, which obviously takes us to things like pricing and reimbursement and the actual usefulness of individual products and how they are used and how they're deployed by doctors, for example, in hospitals. And that's another layer of governance. If we look at validation and verification, this is all about taking care of the risks which occur using AI. And obviously AI isn't is something that is applied and used in products, but those products then get sold on and then get used in different situations. All of us as businesses are likely to be buying in AI products, and when we do that, we're going to have to be thinking about whether we can accept those products and validating and verifying those, and can we trust them and how they've been built. So there may well be industry standards that get developed. Validation and verification is actually a terms of art when it comes to medical device regulation. It's particularly software, so you will validate whether your device actually works to achieve your intended purpose, and then verify once you've built it that it does actually do what it says on the label. But it seems to me that actually all software could be validated and verified in that way. But that verification process is going to need to actually work with the operators of the software tools, particularly in hospitals. And if you're working with consumers, obviously the human factors need to be taken into account as well. And let's hand over now to Claire for financial services.
Yeah, I'll keep it very quick because I'm conscious of time. But I think this point around the wider AI value chain and supply chain is really important, given the multiple different parties involved, and the idea of looking at the resilience of that entire supply chain and the compliance across the supply chain has received a lot of attention in financial services in particular, including in the context of existing regimes around outsourcing, operational resilience, and critical third parties, for example, particularly given some of the potential sort of systemic risks in the financial services industry in particular. But I think one of the points here is around how to sort of build trust across the industry and ensure compliance across the board. And international the international and national picture, including the discussion around sort of standards, is obviously a key part of that. So I think that brings us back to the wider discussion around the broader UK and international regulatory picture and addressing this. And so I'll pass back over to Vicky and Lulu on this.
Thanks so much, Alison and Claire. Really, really interesting to get into that detail a little bit more. Lulu, just coming back to the main sort of fallout from the safety summit, there were a few commentators that thought that the US government somewhat upstaged the UK government because there was the publication of the US executive order. There was also the news of setting up the US AI Safety Institute. Do you see that as the US sort of stealing a march on the UK, or just reflecting the reality of US market power?
Yeah, I think it's not specific to AI to see this kind of behavior and interaction globally. What I would say about AI technologies, though, is that whether it's the US, whether it's China, whether it's the UK, whether it's Europe, all these countries are looking to increase their AI capabilities. There is a, call it sort of like an arms race when it comes to, as I said, increasing capabilities for AI through technological developments and innovations. And although, yes, the executive order on responsible AI was published ahead of the AI Safety Summit, I don't think you can take away exactly from the UK facilitating that global dialogue or even facilitating that action. The fact that the summit was taking place and now is going to be repeated in other countries, you can only see that as a success in a political world. I think where it becomes really interesting, and to some of the stuff that Claire was talking about, is when you think about the difference between the politics and the regulation. Because if you're a tech company, you're going to be thinking about compliance, you're going to be thinking about innovation, and you're going to be thinking about what are the market conditions to make changes to my business, whilst also being able to protect consumers. And you can have the political dialogue happening on the one hand, but on the other hand, you do have different regulatory approaches. And ultimately for tech businesses, the EU AI Act is something where compliance is a real question at the moment. Whereas in the US and the UK, that's not the question. It's a lot more about these voluntary principles, these standards, this creating space for innovation and working with governments to implement changes in a way that supports consumers, but also allows innovation. So I just think drawing that difference between what's happening on a global political sphere and when it comes to international relations and agreement versus what are tech companies seeing when it comes to regulation, and where is this sort of base level standard of compliance that ultimately the EU is driving at the moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose there's also the fundamental question of what the UK does really affect the general regulatory picture around AI, given we've got China already regulating Gen AI, we've got the EU in the wings, we've obviously now got the US. There is this converging sort of noise, which the UK, some would argue, is sort of a bit behind the curve in thinking about its regulation. Just to come back then to Alison and Claire, really, really interesting to focus in on that FCA and MHRA picture, the respective regulators. Do you think, though, that they have the necessary expertise and resource to regulate AI effectively, given there's going to be a huge amount of change in the next little while, given so many companies are going to be using AI? Alison, perhaps you take that one first.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging because actually, does anyone have enough expertise in AI, let alone the regulatory expertise? I'm sure that they will build it. And of course, medical devices actually are not regulated by the MHRA. They're regulated by notified bodies or conformity acceptance bodies. So they don't necessarily need a huge number, but what they do need is enough people who have actually thought through the issues to produce the detail, the level of detail, which the EU itself, although they're ahead in terms of having produced the AI Act, they haven't actually produced the level of detail that's necessary to actually work through what the issues are. And the MHRA has upskilled several years ago to be able to work on that level of detail.
Claire, what about you?
Yeah, similar to that point on upskilling, I think the financial services regulators have made a real effort there in terms of hiring people. That that obviously has some challenges that I think they've acknowledged, but they are really making the effort there. And also that point about dialogue with industry has been something they've been really trying to encourage, that I think has also helped plug some of those gaps. But as we know, there's challenges.
So Lulu, in your view, if you think of what's happening in the EU, think of what's happening in the UK, do you think companies will choose to develop their AI tools in the UK over the EU because they'll consider the UK offers a more favourable regulatory environment for AI?
Not necessarily. I think it's the only way to answer that. I mean, AI regulation is one form of regulation impacting tech companies. It can't really be viewed in total isolation. There's other regulatory issues, like the Online Safety Act has just come into force, which I don't know if people on this webinar have been following that, but some of the implications of provisions within that piece of regulation have resulted in certain companies saying they're going to leave the UK market due to threats to encryption. So I think that we do need to think about digital regulation as a whole. It can't be isolated as, oh, there's AI in the corner here and that's going to drive where innovation happens, because again, if you're a tech company, that's not how it works. You don't separate out these issues in such a succinct way. I think also lots of the sort of foundation models and frontier AI companies are actually UK based, you know, the likes of DeepMind, etc. So I do think that the UK has like a stronghold when it comes to innovation around AI purely on that basis. But we'll have to wait and see based on the implications of other regulatory issues to see whether businesses start to think seriously about leaving markets or prioritization.
Yeah. No, thank you. So all of us really, a question to think about, casting our mind forward 12 months time, what do we think the UK's regulatory framework for AI would look like? Perhaps, Claire, if I come to you first.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more at the sort of sector level, more guidance on specific use cases to try and help developers and deployers of AI systems think about the application of some of those existing legal principles to specific use cases.
Alison?
Yeah, similarly, I think we should see more principles being published, and see the medical device regulations should be published within the next 12 months. But the MHRA has said that that will not include detail on AI because that will come in guidance. So actually that won't come out until probably the following year.
And Lulu, what about yourself, or your thoughts about if we were to meet again in 12 months' time, at what stage of the regulatory process do you think the UK would be at with AI?
Yes, I agree with Alison and Claire that regulators will produce guidance, but there is a risk that there's going to be a change in government. I think I mentioned earlier that we do have a UK general election, has to happen before the end of January 2025. So if there is a change of government, it could result in an upheaval of how AI is regulated. We know that Labour would be a bit more firm about introducing specific regulation to address risks whilst also enhancing public services and protecting workers. So I think it's all to play for. And you know, when I'm working with tech companies or advising clients at the moment, it's very much we need to work out what happens in the election and sort of prepare for every eventuality before being able to give any concrete advice on what's going to happen to the AI white paper or the regulatory approach.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a high degree of uncertainty still in that sense, but of course we do have law coming through in the EU. We do now have at least a position under the US executive order. Well, we're at the end of our time together, so thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you particularly for Lulu for joining us. A quick reminder that you can register on our website for the next session, which is coming up next Wednesday, looking at AI in the workplace. Thank you very much for joining and attending today. If you've got any questions, please do get in touch. Thank you.